The year of our Lord 1844 was a tinderbox in the heart of Georgia, and the Flint River Baptist Church was its crucible. From the imposing pulpit, carved from the heart of an ancient oak, Pastor Thaddeus Thorne's voice boomed, a righteous thunder that rattled the window panes and the very souls of his congregation. His sermons were fiery tapestries woven with threads of damnation for the North's abolitionist heresies and divine sanction for the South's peculiar institution. He spoke of hierarchy as God's own design, of master and servant as a reflection of the celestial order, a sacred trust bestowed upon the white man. And in the front pew, his son, Elias Thorne, felt the heat of his father's words not as a comforting warmth, but as the scorching breath of a furnace. Elias was a young man forged in the shadow of his father's immense presence. He was of a slighter build than the robust pastor, with a thoughtful, almost somber countenance that often seemed at odds with the boisterous certainty that defined the men of his station. His education had taken him to Savannah, where the salt-laced air carried whispers of a world beyond the cotton fields of their own small corner of Georgia, a world of roiling ideas and dissenting voices. He had returned with a disquiet in his soul, a seed of doubt that his father's sermons only served to water. From his seat, Elias's gaze would inevitably drift to the small gallery at the back of the church, the designated place for the enslaved members of the congregation. He could not see her face clearly from this distance, only the silhouette of her form, but he knew she was there. Sarah. She was his father's property, a house servant whose quiet dignity and intelligent eyes had long ago captured his attention in a way that the simpering pleasantries of the eligible daughters of the local gentry never could. Sarah had been born on the Thorne plantation, her mother a skilled seamstress, her father a man sold down the river before she could form a lasting memory of his face. She had inherited her mother's nimble fingers and a quiet resilience that was her only true possession. She had learned to read in secret, taught by Elias's mother before she had succumbed to a fever that had swept through the county. It was a secret they had kept from the pastor, a man who believed literacy in the enslaved was a path to insurrection and discontent. After the service, as the congregation spilled out into the oppressive Georgia sun, the air thick with the scent of magnolias and hypocrisy, Elias would watch his father, a man transformed from a spiritual guide into a master of his domain. Pastor Thorne would greet the wealthy planters with a hearty clap on the back, his laughter echoing across the manicured churchyard, while his eyes, as sharp and cold as a hawk's, would sweep over his own human property, their presence a testament to his prosperity and his standing in the community. Elias, on the other hand, often found himself lingering by the ancient live oak that shaded the church, its sprawling branches a silent witness to generations of whispered secrets and unspoken truths. It was here that he would sometimes catch a fleeting glimpse of Sarah as she was herded back towards the Thorne buggy with the other house servants. Their eyes would meet for a brief electric moment, a silent acknowledgement of a connection that defied the rigid order of their world. One sweltering afternoon, as Elias sought refuge from the suffocating piety of his father's post-sermon conversations, he found Sarah in the cool, dim quiet of the church's small library, a room his father rarely entered. She was carefully dusting a leather-bound volume of poetry, her touch gentle, reverent. The sight of her, surrounded by the words and ideas that were so brutally denied to her, stirred something profound in Elias. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than he intended. She started, her body tensing as if expecting a blow. She turned, her eyes wide, her expression a carefully constructed mask of deference. "Mr. Elias," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the floor. I did not mean to frighten you," he stammered, his usual eloquence deserting him. "I was just tidying up, sir," she said, her voice a low, melodic whisper. Elias took a step closer, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I know what you were doing, Sarah. You were reading." Fear, raw and undisguised, flickered in her eyes. "No, sir, I was just dusting." Elias reached out, his hand hovering for a moment before he gently took the book from her. It was a volume of Keats. "Beauty is truth, truth beauty," he quoted softly, his eyes meeting hers. "That is all you know on earth and all you need to know." And in that shared moment, in the hushed sanctity of the library, the chasm that separated them, The chasm of master and slave seemed to shrink, to become a space that could be bridged by a shared love for the written word. It was a dangerous, intoxicating thought, a thought that would set them on a path from which there would be no return. The Thorn Plantation, a sprawling expanse of cotton and tobacco fields that stretched to the horizon, was a world unto itself, a kingdom ruled by the iron will of Pastor Thaddeus Thorn. The big house, a stately white-columned affair, stood as a monument to his prosperity. Its manicured lawns and blooming gardens, a stark contrast to the grim reality of the slave quarters, a collection of rough-hewn cabins that huddled together as if for warmth, even in the suffocating heat of the Georgia summer. In the dead of night, when the big house was cloaked in a slumbering silence, the quarters would come alive with the soft murmur of whispers, the shared sorrows and fleeting joys of a people bound together by a common yoke. It was in this clandestine world that Sarah found her solace, her community. Here she was not just the pastor's property, she was a sister, a friend, a keeper of stories and a dreamer of impossible dreams. Old Martha, her joints gnarled and her back bent from a lifetime of labor in the fields, was the matriarch of the quarters, her wisdom as deep and abiding as the roots of the ancient cypress trees that lined the riverbank. She had seen generations of her people bought and sold, families torn asunder by the casual cruelty of the master class. She had learned to read the signs, to see the storms gathering on the horizon long before the first clap of thunder. And she saw the storm gathering in Sarah's eyes, a dangerous light that both thrilled and terrified her. "You be careful, child," she would whisper to Sarah as they sat by the flickering embers of a dying fire, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and sorrow. "That boy, Mr. Elias, he ain't like his father, it's true, but he's still a thorn, and a thorn's world is a world of power and privilege, a world that will crush a thing as fragile as the hope I see in your eyes." Sarah would listen, her heart a tumultuous sea of hope and fear. She knew the wisdom in old Martha's words, the bitter truth that had been etched into the very soul of her people, but her encounters with Elias had become more frequent. Their stolen moments in the library, their fleeting glances in the churchyard, their whispered conversations in the shadowy corners of the plantation, a potent brew that intoxicated her, that made her dare to dream of a life beyond the confines of her bondage. Elias, for his part, was a man in turmoil. The world he had once accepted without question, the world his father preached from the pulpit, was beginning to unravel, to reveal its ugly, rotting core. He saw the hypocrisy in his father's pious pronouncements, the stark contradiction between the Christian ideals of love and compassion and the brutal reality of the lash. He saw the humanity in Sarah, a humanity that his society so vehemently denied, and it was a revelation that shook him to his very foundations. He began to question his father, not in open defiance, but with subtle, probing inquiries that chipped away at the granite edifice of the pastor's certainty. He would quote passages from the Bible that spoke of justice and mercy, of the equality of all souls in the eyes of God, only to be met with his father's thunderous dismissals, his pronouncements on the divine order of things, the curse of Ham, the sacred duty of the white man to guide and civilize the lesser races. Their debates would often rage late into the night, the air in the pastor's study thick with the scent of old leather and simmering resentment. "You have been poisoned by those northern abolitionists, boy," Pastor Thorn would roar, his face a mask of righteous fury. "They speak of freedom, but they know nothing of the natural order of things, of the chaos that would ensue if these creatures were left to their own devices." Elias would stand his ground, his voice quiet but firm, his arguments rooted not in the fiery rhetoric of the abolitionists, but in the simple, undeniable truth of Sarah's humanity. "She has a soul, Father," he would say, his words a quiet rebellion against the deafening roar of his father's dogma. "And a soul cannot be owned." These clandestine debates, these stolen moments of intellectual and emotional intimacy with Sarah, were a dangerous game, a dance on the precipice of a chasm that threatened to swallow them whole. The whispers in the gloom of the slave quarters grew more urgent, more fearful. Old Martha's warnings became more dire. But for Elias and Sarah, caught in the intoxicating grip of a love that defied all reason, all logic, all the brutal realities of their world. The whispers of caution were drowned out by the thunderous beating of their own hearts. The world of letters, a world that was a source of liberation for Elias, was a dangerous, forbidden territory for Sarah. The law of the land, the unwritten code of the South, decreed that to teach a slave to read was to arm them with the tools of insurrection, to plant the seeds of rebellion in a soil that was already fertile with discontent. And yet, it was this forbidden world that became the sanctuary for their burgeoning love, the secret garden where their hearts could meet, unburdened by the shackles of their society. Elias, with a reckless disregard for the consequences, began to share his books with Sarah. He would leave them in a hollowed-out log at the edge of the woods that bordered the plantation, a secret, a place known only to them. He would leave a single white wildflower on the log to signal that a new book awaited her, a silent message that spoke of his love, his trust, his defiance. Sarah, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, would steal away to their secret place in the pre-dawn gloom, her senses on high alert for the telltale signs of the overseer's patrol. She would retrieve the book, her fingers trembling as she traced the embossed letters on the cover, her heart soaring with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She would devour the words in the flickering candlelight of her small cabin, the pages illuminated by a light that was both a beacon of hope and a dangerous flame that could consume her. She read the poetry of Byron and Shelley, their passionate verses a mirror of the tempestuous emotions that raged within her own soul. She read the novels of Sir Walter Scott, his tales of chivalry and romance a stark contrast to the brutal reality of her own life. But it was a small, unassuming volume, bound in worn leather, that would change everything. It was a collection of abolitionist pamphlets smuggled from the North that Elias, in a moment of reckless abandon, had left for her. The words within its pages were not the soaring prose of the poets or the romantic escapism of the novelists. They were a stark, brutal indictment of the institution that had defined her existence, a righteous cry for justice and freedom that resonated with the deepest chambers of her heart. She read the words of William Lloyd Garrison, his fiery denunciations of slavery, a cleansing fire that burned away the layers of submission and despair that had been so carefully cultivated within her. She read the impassioned pleas of Frederick Douglass, his eloquent testimony a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a testament to the fact that a soul, no matter how brutalized, could not be extinguished. The words were a revelation, a confirmation of the truths she had always known in her heart, but had never dared to articulate. They gave voice to her anger, her sorrow, her yearning for a life of freedom and dignity. They transformed her from a passive victim of a cruel and unjust system into a conscious and active participant in her own liberation. One night, as Elias met her in their secret place, the moon a sliver of silver in the inky sky, she confronted him, the abolitionist pamphlet clutched in her hand, her eyes blazing with a newfound fire. "You read this, Elias?" she asked, her voice a mixture of awe and accusation. "You believe these words?" Elias, taken aback by the intensity of her gaze, could only nod, his own heart a tumultuous sea of conflicting emotions. "I do, Sarah," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I believe every word." "Then why?" she asked, her voice cracking with the weight of her unspoken question. "Why do you not act? Why do you stand by and watch as your father, as your people, inflict this suffering upon us?" Her question hung in the air between them, a stark and unavoidable challenge. It was a question that would force Elias to confront the chasm between his beliefs and his actions, between the man he wanted to be and the man his society had raised him to be. It was a question that would set them on a perilous path, a path that would lead them to a covenant that was both a declaration of their love and an act of open rebellion. The humid Georgia night was a thick black velvet, studded with the distant, indifferent glitter of a million stars. The air, heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine and damp earth, was alive with the chirping of crickets and the mournful hoot of an owl. In the deep shadows of the woods that bordered the Thorn plantation, a place of sanctuary and secrecy, Elias Thorn and Sarah stood before each other, their faces illuminated by the soft, ethereal glow of a full moon. The weight of Sarah's challenge, her impassioned plea for action, had settled deep within Elias's soul, a disquieting presence that had robbed him of his sleep, his peace of mind. He could no longer reconcile his love for Sarah, his intellectual and moral abhorrence of slavery, with his passive acceptance of his role in a system that was built on the foundation of human suffering. He had spent days in turmoil, his mind a battleground of conflicting loyalties, of fear and conviction. He knew that to act, to openly defy his father and the society that had nurtured him, was to invite ruin, to become an outcast, a pariah. And yet, to do nothing, to continue to live a life that was a lie, was a betrayal of his own soul, a betrayal of the love he felt for Sarah. And so, on this night, under the silent, watchful gaze of the heavens, he had made his choice. He had come to their secret place not with a book, but with a promise, a covenant that he intended to make not just with Sarah, but with his own conscience, with his God. "Sarah," he began, his voice thick with emotion, his hand reaching for hers, his touch sending a jolt of electricity through her. "You were right to challenge me. I have been a coward, a man who has hidden behind the comfort of his convictions, who has been afraid to live them." Sarah's eyes, luminous in the moonlight, searched his, her expression a mixture of hope and apprehension. "What are you saying, Elias?" she whispered, her voice a fragile thread in the vast tapestry of the night. Elias took a deep breath, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "I am saying that I will not be a part of this world any longer. I cannot be the son of a man who preaches a gospel of bondage. I cannot be a master of a people who deserve to be free." He dropped to one knee, his eyes never leaving hers, his hand tightening around hers. "I am not a wealthy man, Sarah. I have no land, no fortune of my own. All that I have, all that I am, is tied to my father, to a world that I now renounce. But I offer you what I do have. I offer you my heart, my soul, my name. I offer you my life." He reached into his pocket and produced a small, simple ring, fashioned from a piece of twisted silver. It was not a grand or expensive piece of jewelry, but it was a symbol of a promise that was more precious than all the gold in Georgia. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling with the force of his emotions, "I am asking you to be my wife, to join me in a covenant, a sacred promise to each other, to a life of freedom, a life where we will be judged not by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, tracing silver paths down her cheeks. In a world that had denied her the most basic of human rights, the right to love, to marry, to build a family, Elias's proposal was an act of such profound love, such reckless defiance, that it took her breath away. It was a dangerous, impossible dream, a dream that could very well lead to their destruction. And yet, in that moment, under the silent, watchful gaze of the stars, it was a dream she could not, would not, refuse. "Yes, Elias," she whispered, her voice choked with tears. "Yes, I will be your wife." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, a symbol of a love that was as boundless as the night sky. And as their lips met in a kiss that was both a promise and a prayer, a covenant was sealed, a hidden covenant of 1844, a pact made not in the hallowed halls of a church, but in the sacred sanctuary of the woods, a pact that would forever bind their fates, for better or for worse, in a world that was determined to tear them apart. The first tremors of the earthquake that would shatter the foundations of the Thorne family came not in a sudden, violent cataclysm, but in a series of subtle, unsettling shifts. Elias, emboldened by his secret covenant with Sarah, began to withdraw from the world of his father. His absences from the dinner table more frequent, his participation in the life of the plantation more perfunctory. He no longer engaged his father in theological debates, his silence a more potent form of defiance than his previous arguments. He spent his days in the woods, his books his only companions, his mind a whirlwind of plans and preparations for a future that was as uncertain as it was exhilarating. Pastor Thorne, a man accustomed to the unquestioning obedience of his household, was not oblivious to the change in his son. He saw the new light in Elias's eyes, a defiant spark that he could not extinguish, a quiet strength that he could not break. He sensed the growing distance between them, a chasm that was far deeper than their previous disagreements over the morality of slavery. He attributed his son's strange behavior to the lingering influence of his northern education, a poison that had taken root in his soul and was now bearing its bitter fruit. He redoubled his efforts to bring Elias back into the fold, his sermons becoming more pointed, his dinner table pronouncements more dogmatic. He spoke of filial duty, of the sacred bond between a father and a son, his words a thinly veiled accusation of betrayal. But his words fell on deaf ears. Elias, his heart and soul now bound to Sarah, was no longer a captive of his father's world. He was a man with a secret, a purpose, a love that had transformed him from a timid scholar into a quiet revolutionary. The breaking point came on a sweltering Sunday afternoon, a day when the air was so thick with humidity that it felt like a physical weight, a suffocating blanket that mirrored the oppressive atmosphere in the Thorne household. Elias, who had pleaded illness to avoid attending his father's sermon, was in his room, poring over a map of the northern states, his mind tracing the perilous path to freedom. He had a small sum of money saved from his time in Savannah, enough to secure passage on a northbound ship, enough to start a new life, a life of their own, in a place where their love would not be a crime. The plan was fraught with danger, the risks immense, but the thought of a life with Sarah, a life of freedom and dignity, was a beacon of hope that guided him through the darkest corridors of his fear. He was so engrossed in his planning that he did not hear the heavy tread of his father's footsteps in the hallway, did not sense his presence until the pastor's shadow fell across the map, a dark and ominous eclipse. Elias looked up, his heart lurching in his chest. His father's face was a thundercloud, his eyes blazing with a righteous fury that was more terrifying than any of his pulpit pronouncements. "What is the meaning of this, boy?" Pastor Thorne roared, his voice a clap of thunder that shook the very foundations of the room. He snatched the map from the desk, his eyes scanning the carefully drawn route, the names of the northern cities, a litany of abolitionist heresies. Elias, his mind racing, tried to stammer an explanation, but his father cut him off, his voice dripping with contempt. "Do not lie to me, Elias. I am not a fool. I know what this is. You are planning to run away, to abandon your family, your heritage, your God, for the sake of those northern traitors." He crumpled the map in his fist, his knuckles white with rage. "I have been patient with you, Elias. I have tolerated your youthful indiscretions, your misguided notions of a world that does not exist. But this is an act of open rebellion, an act of betrayal that I will not countenance." He took a step closer, his massive frame looming over Elias, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "You will renounce these foolish ideas, Elias. You will beg for my forgiveness, for God's forgiveness. You will take your rightful place in this family, in this society. Or, so help me God, you will be no son of mine." The pastor's ultimatum hung in the air, a stark and brutal choice. Elias, his face pale but his eyes resolute, rose to his feet, his own quiet strength a surprising counterpoint to his father's blustering rage. "I cannot do that, Father," he said, his voice firm, unwavering. "I cannot renounce the truth. I cannot live a lie." The pastor's face contorted in a mask of fury. He raised his hand, his intention clear. But before he could strike, a new voice, a voice that was both soft and strong, a voice that he had never heard speak with such authority, cut through the tense silence of the room. "Do not touch him." Pastor Thorne froze, his hand hovering in midair. He turned, his eyes widening in disbelief. In the doorway, her head held high, her eyes blazing with a righteous fire of her own, stood Sarah. She was no longer the meek and submissive servant he had known her to be. She was a woman transformed, a woman who had found her voice, her power, her courage. The preacher's fury, once a force of nature that had cowed all who stood before it, was now met with a force that was its equal, a force that was born not of power and privilege, but of love and conviction. The battle lines had been drawn. The hidden covenant of 1844 was about to be tested in the crucible of a father's wrath. The air in Elias's room crackled with an almost unbearable tension. Pastor Thorne, his face a mask of incredulous fury, stared at Sarah as if she were an apparition, a specter from a world he did not recognize. The sight of his own property, a creature he had always considered to be as docile and submissive as a lamb, standing before him with such an air of defiance, was a shock to his system. a violation of the natural order of things that he held so dear. "What did you say, girl?" he growled, his voice a low, menacing rumble. Sarah, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, did not flinch. She took a step into the room, her eyes never leaving the pastor's, her voice clear and unwavering. "I said, do not touch him." The pastor's face contorted in a sneer of contempt. "You dare to speak to me in that tone? You, a creature of my own household, a piece of property that I can buy and sell as I please." He took a menacing step towards her, his hand raised, but Elias moved quickly, placing himself between Sarah and his father, his body a shield against the pastor's wrath. "Do not lay a hand on her, father," Elias said, his voice laced with a cold fury that his father had never heard before. "She is not your property. She is my wife." The words, spoken with a quiet, steely resolve, hung in the air, a bombshell that shattered the fragile peace of the Thorne household. The pastor stared at his son, his mouth agape, his mind struggling to comprehend the enormity of what he had just heard. "Your wife?" he stammered, the word a foreign, obscene sound on his tongue. Elias, his arm protectively around Sarah, met his father's gaze, his own eyes blazing with a defiant fire. "Yes, my wife. We were married in the eyes of God, if not in the eyes of your law." He held up Sarah's hand, the simple silver ring on her finger, a glint of defiance in the dim light of the room. "We made a covenant, Father, a sacred promise to each other, a promise that no man, not even you, can break." The pastor's face, which had been a mask of fury, now crumpled in a look of utter bewilderment, of profound, soul-shattering disbelief. He stumbled back, his hand clutching his chest as if he had been struck a physical blow. You have defiled yourself, Elias," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, broken sound. "You have defiled the house of God, the blood of your ancestors. You have lain with a creature of the fields, a thing without a soul." "She has more of a soul than you will ever know, Father," Elias retorted, his voice dripping with contempt. "She has more courage, more dignity, more humanity in her little finger than you have in your entire being." The pastor, his face ashen, his body trembling with a mixture of rage and despair, seemed to shrink before their eyes. The fiery, indomitable preacher who had held his congregation in the palm of his hand was gone, replaced by a broken old man, his world in ruins, his certainties shattered. He turned his back on them, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "Get out," he whispered, his voice a ragged, defeated sound. "Get out of my house. You are no son of mine. And you," he said, his voice rising to a venomous hiss as he turned to Sarah, "you are no longer my property. You are a free woman who will burn in the fires of hell for all eternity." He turned and strode from the room, his footsteps a heavy, mournful dirge on the polished wooden floors. The unveiling was complete. The hidden covenant had been brought into the light, and the consequences, as they had always known, were devastating. Elias and Sarah stood in the sudden, deafening silence of the room, their hearts a mixture of terror and exhilaration. They were free. They were also outcasts, fugitives, with nothing but their love and their courage to guide them through the uncertain and perilous journey that lay ahead. The road to freedom, they now understood, was not a destination, but a journey that had only just begun. The pastor's decree of freedom, delivered in a torrent of rage and despair, was not a gift, but a curse. It was a freedom that came with a price, a freedom that cast them out into a world that was as hostile as it was unforgiving. Elias and Sarah, now fugitives in their own land, had no choice but to flee, to seek refuge in the north, a distant, almost mythical land that had once been a symbol of hope, but was now their only chance for survival. They left under the cloak of darkness, their few meager possessions bundled in a small, worn satchel. The moon, their only companion, cast long, eerie shadows across the familiar landscape of the plantation, a landscape that had once been their home, but was now a place of danger, a place of ghosts and bitter memories. They moved with a stealth and urgency born of desperation, their senses on high alert for any sign of pursuit. The sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves, the hoot of an owl, which had once been a source of comfort, were now a symphony of potential threats. Their destination was a small, secluded cove on the Flint River, a place where a sympathetic Quaker, a man who had long been a secret abolitionist, had promised to meet them with a small boat that would take them downstream to a larger vessel bound for the north. The journey was a perilous one, a desperate scramble through dense woods and treacherous swamps, the air thick with the stench of stagnant water and decaying vegetation. They were tormented by mosquitoes, their clothes torn by thorns, their bodies aching with a fatigue that was as much a product of fear as it was of physical exertion. But they were sustained by a single, unwavering hope, a hope that was as constant and as guiding as the North Star that shone brightly in the sooty sky. They spoke little, their communication a series of whispered words, of shared glances, of reassuring touches. Their love, forged in the crucible of secrecy and defiance, was now their only anchor in a world that had been turned upside down. As they neared the river, the sound of the water, a gentle, lapping rhythm, was a beacon of hope in the darkness. They saw the faint flicker of a lantern, a prearranged signal from their Quaker contact, and their hearts soared with a mixture of relief and anticipation. They were met by a man named Jedediah, a gaunt, somber figure with kind, gentle eyes that belied his stern demeanor. He greeted them with a quiet nod, his words few, but his actions speaking volumes. He helped them into the small boat, his hands steady and sure, his presence a calming influence in the turbulent sea of their emotions. As they pushed off from the shore, the gentle current of the river carrying them away from the land of their birth, the land of their bondage, Sarah looked back at the receding shoreline, a dark, foreboding silhouette against the starlit sky. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a tear not of sorrow, but of a profound, heart-wrenching sense of loss. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, her community, her friends, the graves of her ancestors. Elias, sensing her turmoil, took her hand, his touch a gentle reassurance. "We are together, Sarah," he whispered, his voice a beacon of hope in the darkness. "And that is all that matters." She squeezed his hand, her own quiet strength returning. He was right. They were together. They were free. And as the small boat glided silently down the river, the North Star their guiding light, they knew that their journey was far from over, that the road ahead would be fraught with danger and uncertainty. But they also knew that they would face it together, their love their compass, their courage their shield, their hidden covenant, their unbreakable bond. The journey down the Flint River was a surreal, dreamlike passage through a world of shadows and whispers. The moon, their silent a sentinel, cast a silver sooty path on the dark, swirling waters, the banks of the river a blur of tangled vegetation and ancient, gnarled trees that seemed to reach for them with skeletal fingers. Jedediah, their Quaker guide, was a man of few words, his weathered face a stoic mask that betrayed no emotion. He navigated the treacherous currents with a skill born of long experience, his every movement economical and precise. He was a silent, reassuring presence, a steady hand at the tiller in the turbulent sea of their uncertainty. Elias and Sarah, huddled together in the small boat, were a bundle of raw, jangled nerves. Every rustle of leaves on the riverbank, every splash of a fish in the water, every hoot of an owl in the distance, sent a fresh jolt of fear through them. They were fugitives in a hostile land, their freedom a fragile, precious thing that could be snatched away at any moment. They traveled by night, hiding during the day in secluded coves and dense thickets. Their only food a meager supply of dried beef and hardtack that Jedediah had provided. The days were long and tedious, the air thick with the oppressive heat and humidity of the Georgia summer. They were tormented by mosquitoes and biting flies, their bodies covered in a patchwork of red, itchy welts. But the physical discomfort was a small price to pay for their freedom. In these stolen moments of quiet seclusion, they found a strange and unexpected intimacy. They talked for hours, their voices low and hushed, sharing stories of their past, their dreams for the future. They spoke of the books they had read, the ideas that had shaped them, the love that had brought them together. It was in these quiet, stolen moments that they truly began to know each other, not as master and slave, but as man and woman, as husband and wife. The barriers that had once separated them, the artificial constructs of a cruel and unjust society, crumbled away, leaving behind a love that was pure, strong, and true. After several days of this perilous, clandestine journey, they reached the mouth of the river, where the dark, swirling waters of the Flint met the vast, open expanse of the Gulf of Mexico. The sight of the open sea, a boundless horizon that stretched to the ends of the earth, was a breathtaking symbol of their newfound freedom. Here, in a secluded hidden harbor, a larger vessel, a schooner named the North Star, awaited them. It was a weather-beaten, salt-stained vessel that had seen better days, but to Elias and Sarah it was the most beautiful ship in the world. Jedediah led them aboard, where they were met by the captain, a gruff, grizzled New Englander named Silas, a man whose hardened exterior concealed a heart of gold. He was another link in the chain of the Underground Railroad, a secret network of brave and compassionate souls who risked their own lives and liberty to help a people in their desperate flight to freedom. "Welcome aboard," Silas said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "The journey ahead will not be an easy one, but we will see you to safety, or my name ain't Silas." As the North Star set sail, its canvas sails catching the salty sea breeze, Elias and Sarah stood on the deck, their hands clasped together, their eyes fixed on the receding shoreline of the land that had been both their prison and their home. They were leaving behind a world of pain and suffering, a world of injustice and oppression. But they were also leaving behind a part of themselves, a history that was etched into their very souls. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, the future uncertain. But as they sailed into the vast, open expanse of the sea, the North Star their guiding light, they were filled with a sense of hope, a sense of a new beginning. They were free. They were together. And for the first time in their lives, they were the masters of their own destiny. The sea voyage was a baptism by fire, a tumultuous journey through a world of towering waves and howling winds. The North Star, a sturdy but aging vessel, was tossed about like a cork on the turbulent waters of the Atlantic, its timbers groaning in protest against the relentless assault of the sea. Elias and Sarah, unaccustomed to the violent motion of the ship, were racked with seasickness, their bodies weak, their spirits flagging. They spent most of their days in a small, cramped cabin below deck, the air thick with the smell of salt, tar, and unwashed bodies. But even in the midst of their physical misery, they found moments of a strange and unexpected beauty. They would watch the dolphins playing in the ship's wake, their sleek silver bodies a symbol of a freedom that was as boundless as the sea itself. They would marvel at the sunsets, the sky a fiery canvas of orange, pink, and gold, a daily masterpiece that was a testament to the enduring power of hope. After what felt like an eternity, they finally reached the shores of Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, a place that had long been a beacon of hope for a people fleeing the tyranny of the South. The sight of the city's bustling harbor, the forest of masts and sails, the cacophony of sounds and smells, was a shock to their senses, a world away from the quiet, bucolic world of the Thorn Plantation. They were met at the docks by a member of the local abolitionist society, a stern-faced but kind-hearted Quaker woman named Prudence, who whisked them away in a covered carriage, their faces hidden from the prying eyes of the curious onlookers. She took them to a safe house in the heart of the city, a simple, unassuming brick row house that was a sanctuary for a people on the run. Here, in this Quaker's haven, they found a sense of peace and security that they had never known before. The house was run by a community of Quakers, a people whose quiet, unwavering faith was matched only by their fierce and uncompromising commitment to the cause of abolition. They were a people of few words, their actions speaking louder than any sermon. They treated Elias and Sarah not as fugitives or as objects of pity, but as fellow human beings, as friends, as family. For the first time in their lives, Elias and Sarah could walk the streets without fear, could speak their minds without reservation, could love each other without shame. They were free, but they soon discovered that freedom was not a destination, but a journey that came with its own set of challenges and responsibilities. Elias, with his education and his eloquence, was quickly drawn into the abolitionist movement. He began to speak at public meetings, his testimony as the son of a Southern slaveholder a powerful and compelling indictment of the institution that he had once been a part of. His words, delivered with a quiet, passionate intensity, moved his audiences to tears, to anger, to action. Sarah, too, found her voice in this new world of freedom. She, who had been denied the right to speak, to learn, to dream, now discovered that she had a story to tell, a story of resilience, of courage, of hope. She began to work with other fugitive people, helping them to adjust to their new lives, to find work, to build a community. They were no longer just Elias and Sarah, the pastor's son and his father's slave. They were now Mr. and Mrs. Thorne, respected members of the abolitionist community. Their love story a powerful symbol of the transformative power of love and the enduring human yearning for freedom. But even in this Quaker's haven, the shadows of the past still lingered. The South, with its long and vengeful arm, was not a world away, but a constant, menacing presence. They knew that their freedom was a fragile, precious thing, a thing that they would have to fight to protect, a thing that they would have to be willing to die for. Philadelphia, for all its Quaker piety and abolitionist fervor, was not the utopia they had imagined. The city, like the nation itself, was a house divided, a place of stark contrasts and simmering tensions. The promise of freedom was a fragile and elusive thing, a thing that was constantly threatened by the long, grasping tentacles of the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that made a mockery of the very notion of a free state. The city was teeming with slave catchers, ruthless men who prowled the streets like wolves, their pockets lined with the blood money of the Southern planters. They were a constant, menacing presence, a grim reminder that the chains of bondage were not so easily broken. Elias and Sarah, now living under the assumed name of Mr. and Mrs. Harris, were forced to live a life of constant vigilance, their every move shrouded in secrecy. They were prisoners of their own freedom, their new life a gilded cage. Elias, his face now a familiar one in the abolitionist circles, was a prime target for the slave catchers. His powerful and eloquent speeches, his damning indictment of the Southern way of life, had made him a marked man. There was a price on his head, a bounty that would make a rich man of anyone who could deliver him back to the clutches of his father. Sarah, too, was in constant danger. Her beauty, her intelligence, her quiet dignity were a dangerous combination in a world that was so determined to see her as something less than human. She was a prize to be captured, a trophy to be displayed, a testament to the unassailable power of the master class. They lived in a state of constant, gnawing fear, their nights filled with a terrifying specters of the past, their days a tightrope walk over a chasm of uncertainty. Every knock on the door, every unfamiliar face in the street, sent a fresh jolt of terror through them. But their fear was tempered by a fierce and unwavering resolve. They had come too far, sacrificed too much, to surrender to the forces of darkness. They were no longer the timid, frightened fugitives who had fled the Thorn plantation under the cloak of darkness. They were now battle-hardened veterans in the war against slavery. Their love, their shield, their courage, their sword. They continued their work in the abolitionist movement, their voices growing stronger, their commitment deeper. They knew that their own personal freedom was inextricably linked to the freedom of their people, that they could not truly be free until all were free. They found a community of like-minded souls, a family of fellow fugitives and dedicated abolitionists who provided them with a sense of belonging, of purpose, of hope. They were a small but determined band of brothers and sisters, their lives a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, their cause a righteous and just one. But the long arm of the South was relentless. One evening, as Elias was returning from an abolitionist meeting, he was ambushed by a group of slave catchers, their faces contorted in a mask of greedy anticipation. They were big, burly men, their eyes as cold and as hard as river stones. Elias fought back with a ferocity that surprised them, his scholar's hands now the fists of a street fighter. But he was outnumbered, and they soon overpowered him, their rough hands binding him, their jeering laughter a symphony of pure, unadulterated evil. They dragged him through the dark, deserted streets, their destination a secret holding pen on the outskirts of the city, a place where captured fugitives were held before being shipped back to the South, back to a life of bondage. back to a fate that was worse than death. As he was being dragged away, his heart a cold, hard knot of despair, he managed to cry out Sarah's name. His voice a desperate, agonized plea that was swallowed up by the indifferent silence of the night. It was a cry of love, of defiance, of a hope that refused to be extinguished. A hope that was now in the hands of the woman he loved, the woman who was his wife, his partner, his everything. The news of Elias's capture spread through the abolitionist community like a wildfire, a devastating blow that sent shockwaves of fear and outrage through their ranks. But in the midst of their despair, a new and powerful force emerged, a force that was as fierce and as unwavering as the love that had brought Elias and Sarah together. Sarah, who had once been the timid, submissive slave, was now a lioness, her grief and her fear transformed into a righteous fury that would not be denied. She refused to surrender to despair, to accept the grim and brutal reality of Elias's fate. She would not let him be dragged back to the hell that they had escaped. She would fight for him, for their love, for their freedom, with every fiber of her being. She rallied the abolitionist community, her impassioned pleas for help a clarion call to action. She was no longer just a person who had escaped slavery, a symbol of the cause. She was now a leader, a warrior, a woman who would move heaven and earth to save the man she loved. The abolitionists, moved by her courage and her determination, responded with a swift and decisive force. They were a diverse and dedicated group, a motley crew of Quakers, free blacks, and white sympathizers, united by a common cause, a common belief in the inherent dignity and worth of every human being. They devised a daring and audacious plan, a plan to storm the holding pen where Elias was being held, a plan to snatch him from the very jaws of the beast. It was a risky, almost suicidal mission, a mission that could very well end in their own capture, their own death. But it was a risk they were willing to take. Under the cloak of darkness, they descended on the holding pen, a grim, foreboding structure on the outskirts of the city. They were armed not with guns and swords, but with the unshakable conviction of their own righteousness, the unwavering belief in the justice of their cause. The slave catchers, caught by surprise, were no match for the righteous fury of the abolitionists. The battle was brief but brutal, a chaotic and desperate struggle in the dead of night. In the end, the forces of freedom prevailed. Elias was liberated, his chains broken, his spirit bruised but not shattered. The reunion between Elias and Sarah was a tearful, joyous affair, a testament to the enduring power of their love, a love that had been tested in the crucible of adversity and had emerged stronger, more resilient, more unbreakable than ever before. But their victory came at a price. The raid on the holding pen had exposed them, had made them fugitives once more. They could no longer stay in Philadelphia, a city that was now a place of danger, a place of betrayal. They had no choice but to flee once more, to seek refuge in the north, in a land that was even more distant, more mythical than Philadelphia had once been. Their destination was Canada, a land where slavery was a thing of the past, a land where the Fugitive Slave Act had no power, a land where they could finally, truly be free. The journey ahead would be long and perilous, the road fraught with danger and uncertainty. But they would face it together, their love their compass, their courage their shield, their hidden covenant, their unbreakable bond. They were no longer just fugitives, no longer just abolitionists. They were now pioneers, trailblazers, forging a new path to freedom, a path that would be followed by countless others, a path that would one day lead to the promised land. The journey to Canada was a grueling and arduous one, a desperate flight through a landscape that was as beautiful as it was treacherous. They traveled by foot, by horse-drawn cart, by canal boat, their every move shrouded in a cloak of secrecy, their path guided by the secret signs and symbols of the Underground Railroad. They were a part of a small, determined band of fugitives, a community of souls bound together by a common experience, a common dream. They shared their meager rations, their stories of sorrow and of hope, their unwavering belief in a future that was free of the lash, of the auction block, of the constant, gnawing fear that had been their constant companion for so long. Elias and Sarah, now seasoned veterans in the art of escape, became leaders in this small, mobile community. Elias, With his knowledge of the written word, his ability to read maps and to decipher the coded messages of the Underground Railroad, was their navigator, their guide. Sarah, with her quiet strength, her boundless compassion, her deep and abiding faith, was their spiritual anchor, their source of comfort and of hope. They faced countless dangers along the way. They were pursued by slave catchers, their baying hounds terrifying a symphony of the night. They were betrayed by those who had promised to help them, their hopes dashed by the cruel and casual treachery of a people who had been poisoned by the venom of racism. But for every act of betrayal, there was an act of kindness, of compassion, of courage. They were sheltered by farmers who risked their own lives and liberty to provide them with a safe haven. They were fed by women who shared their last loaf of bread, their last drop of milk. They were guided by conductors on the Underground Railroad, brave and selfless souls who were the unsung heroes of the abolitionist movement. One night, as they were huddled around a small, crackling fire in a dense, secluded forest, an old man, his face a roadmap of a long and difficult life, pointed to the sky, to the constellation that had been their constant companion on their long and perilous journey. "That there is the drinking gourd," he said, his voice a low, raspy whisper. "You follow that, and it will lead you to the North Star. And the North Star, well, the North Star, she will lead you to freedom." His words, spoken with a simple, profound faith, resonated deep within their souls. The North Star, which had once been a distant, almost mythical symbol of hope, was now a tangible, attainable reality. It was a promise, a covenant, a guarantee that their suffering had not been in vain, that their dream of a new life, a life of freedom and dignity, was within their grasp. After weeks of this arduous, soul-testing journey, they finally reached the shores of the Niagara River, the final barrier between the land of bondage and the land of freedom. The sight of the river, its powerful churning waters a symbol of the great divide between their past and their future, was a breathtaking and awe-inspiring sight. They were ferried across the river in a small, rickety boat, the roar of the falls a thunderous symphony of their liberation. And as they stepped onto Canadian soil, a land where the air itself seemed to be infused with the sweet, intoxicating scent of freedom, they fell to their knees, their hearts overflowing with a gratitude that was too deep for words. They were free. They had reached the promised land. The North Star had kept its promise. Their new life in Canada was a far cry from the bustling, cosmopolitan world of Philadelphia. They settled in a small, rural community of fellow fugitives, a place called Buxton, a settlement that had been founded by an Irish-born Presbyterian minister who had dedicated his life to the cause of abolition. Buxton was a haven, a sanctuary, a place where they could finally put down roots, where they could build a new life, a new home, a new community. The land was fertile, the air was clean, the people were kind and welcoming. It was a place where a man was judged not by the color of his skin, but by the sweat of his brow, the strength of his character. Elias, the scholar, became a farmer, his soft, uncalloused hands now hardened by the toil of clearing the land, of planting the crops, of building a home for himself and his beloved Sarah. He found a deep and abiding satisfaction in this simple, honest labor, a connection to the earth that he had never known before. Sarah, the house slave, became a teacher, her thirst for knowledge now a gift that she shared with the children of the community. She taught them to read, to write, to dream, to believe in a future that was limited only by the boundaries of their own imagination. She was a natural-born teacher, her classroom a place of joy, of discovery, of empowerment. They built a small, simple cabin, a home that was filled not with the material possessions of their former life, but with the intangible treasures of love, of laughter, of peace. They planted a garden, a small patch of earth where they grew vegetables and flowers, a symbol of their new life, a life that was rooted in the fertile soil of freedom. In this garden in the wilderness, their love blossomed, their bond deepened. They were no longer just fugitives, no longer just survivors. They were now pioneers, community builders, architects of a new world, a world that was founded on the principles of justice, of equality, of love. They had a child, a son, whom they named Jedediah, in honor of the Quaker, who had been their first guide on their long and perilous journey to freedom. He was a beautiful, healthy child, his skin the color of warm honey, his eyes a reflection of the deep and abiding love that had brought his parents together. He was a child of freedom, a child of hope, a symbol of a new generation that would be born free of the shackles of bondage. He was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, a living embodiment of the hidden covenant of 1844, a covenant that had been forged in the crucible of adversity and had now borne its sweet and precious fruit. Years passed. The small fledgling community of Buxton grew and prospered, a testament to the industry, the resilience, and the unwavering spirit of its inhabitants. The garden that Elias and Sarah had planted had flourished, its bounty a symbol of the new life they had built together, a life that was rich in the things that truly mattered: love, family, community, freedom. Their son, Jedediah, grew into a strong, intelligent, and compassionate young man, his spirit untainted by the bitter legacy of slavery. He was a child of the North, a product of a world that was a universe away from the brutal reality of the thorn plantation. But the echoes of the past, though distant, were not entirely silenced. One day, a letter arrived, its postmark a ghostly reminder of a world they had left behind. It was from a lawyer in Georgia, informing them that Pastor Thaddeus Thorne had passed away. The news was met not with celebration, but with a quiet, somber reflection. The pastor, for all his cruelty and his bigotry, was still Elias's father, a man whose shadow had loomed large over his life, a man whose legacy was as complex as it was contradictory. The letter also contained a surprising revelation. In his will, the pastor had left a small inheritance to Elias, a sum of money that was a pittance compared to the vast fortune he had amassed, but was a gesture that was as unexpected as it was inexplicable. But it was a small, handwritten note attached to the will that was the most startling revelation of all. It was from the pastor, written in a shaky, almost illegible hand, a deathbed confession that was a testament to the transformative power of grace, of repentance, of love. "My dearest son," the note began. The words a stark and stunning departure from the pastor's usual fire and brimstone rhetoric. "I have been a fool, a blind and arrogant man who has mistaken his own pride for the will of God. I have sinned against you, against your wife, against a people who have suffered grievously at my hands. I beg for your forgiveness, for God's forgiveness. May you find in this small inheritance a token of my repentance, a symbol of a love that I was too blind to see, too proud to acknowledge. Your father, Thaddeus Thorne." The letter was a bombshell, a revelation that shattered the carefully constructed image of the unyielding, unrepentant patriarch. It was a testament to the fact that even the hardest of hearts can be softened, that even the most deeply ingrained prejudices can be overcome, that even in the darkest of souls, there is a flicker of light, a glimmer of hope. Elias and Sarah, their hearts a mixture of sorrow, of forgiveness, of a profound and abiding sense of peace, made a decision. They would use the inheritance not for themselves, but for the community that had become their home, their family, their sanctuary. They built a school, a place of learning and of hope, a place that would be a beacon of light for generations to come. They named it the Thorne School, a testament not to the man who had been a symbol of oppression, but to the man who had, in the end, found his way back to the path of righteousness, to the God of love and of mercy that he had so grievously misunderstood. The Thorne School became the heart of the Buxton community, a place where the children of former slaves could receive an education that was denied to them in the land of their birth, a place where they could learn to read, to write, to dream, to become the architects of their own destiny. Elias and Sarah, now in the twilight of their years, were the revered elders of the community, their love story a legend, their lives a testament to the enduring power of hope, of courage, of love. They had witnessed the end of the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, the dawn of a new era in the history of their people. They had lived to see their son, Jedediah, become a doctor, a man who dedicated his life to healing the sick, to serving his community, to carrying on the legacy of his parents, a legacy of compassion, of justice, of love. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their small cabin, their hands clasped together, their hearts filled with a deep and abiding sense of peace, They watched the sun set over the horizon, the sky a fiery canvas of orange, pink, and gold. "Do you remember that night, Elias?" Sarah whispered, her voice a soft, gentle melody. "The night we made our covenant, under the stars?" Elias smiled, his eyes twinkling with the memory of that long-ago night. "I remember it as if it were yesterday," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was the night my life truly began." They sat in a comfortable silence, their hearts overflowing with a gratitude that was too deep for words. They had faced unimaginable hardships, had overcome insurmountable obstacles, had endured the darkest of nights, but they had done it together, their love, their compass, their courage, their shield, their hidden covenant, their unbreakable bond. The covenant they had made in the deep shadows of the Georgia woods, a pact of love and of defiance, had not been broken. It had been tested, it had been tried, it had been forged in the crucible of adversity, and it had emerged stronger, more resilient, more unbreakable than ever before. It was a covenant that had not only bound their two souls together, but had also become a part of a larger story, a story of a people's struggle for freedom, a story of a nation's long and painful journey towards a more perfect union. And as the last rays of the setting sun painted the sky in hues of purple and of gold, they knew that their story, the story of the pastor's son who had secretly wed his father's slave, was not just their story. It was a story for the ages, a story of the enduring power of love to conquer hate, of the unwavering strength of the human spirit to triumph over adversity, of the unbreakable promise of a hidden covenant that had been forged in the heart of a nation that was still struggling to find its soul.